Rick Ross opened his own coffin on national radio, and he didn't even realize the microphone was the shovel. Rick Ross stood there smiling, chain shining, voice booming, telling the world he was the biggest of all time, and while Rick Ross was busy crowning himself, an incarcerated rival with no press run, no interviews, no billboards, and no social media war machine was quietly loading a bullet with Rick Ross's name carved into the tip. What happened next did not just embarrass Rick Ross. It rewrote the ceiling of Rick Ross's entire career in front of a live audience of millions. And the worst part? Rick Ross was warned. Rick Ross laughed. Rick Ross doubled down. And then the numbers dropped, and hip-hop watched a 20-year empire fold in a single Tuesday morning. Buckle up, because what you are about to hear is not a comeback story. It is an autopsy in real time. Nobody expected this. Nobody. Not the analysts, not the label insiders, not the loyal Maybach music soldiers who had been writing for Rick Ross since the Port of Miami days. When the first week tally hit the Billboard system, the tracking servers registered a figure so low that people initially thought it was a typo. Rick Ross, the self-proclaimed biggest boss, the man who spent months telling every camera he could find that his new album Set in Stone was one of the greatest bodies of work in modern rap history, Rick Ross pulled in 17,200 units. That is not a slow start. That is not a soft opening. That is a car crash caught on tape, and the driver is still bragging about the steering wheel. In an era where a mid-tier newcomer with a viral clip can move 50,000 copies without breaking a sweat, 17,000 from a legacy artist with a 2-decade catalog reads like an obituary written in Billboard ink. Meanwhile, sitting behind bars, wearing a jumpsuit instead of a jeweled chain, Tory Lanez dropped a project called Made You Think I Was Gone. Tory Lanez did 0 interviews. Tory Lanez did 0 podcast appearances. Tory Lanez posted no promotional videos, ran no ad campaigns, and had no team of publicists booking morning show slots. Tory Lanez pulled 19,700 units. Let those two numbers sit next to each other for a second. 20,000 from a prison cell. 17,000 from a 20-year veteran with a Wingstop empire, a car show, a Rolls-Royce garage, and a promotional army. That gap is not a gap. That is a verdict. And it was handed down not by critics, not by executives, and not by rivals, but by the paying public itself, in real time, with real dollars, on the exact same Tuesday. And when the verdict landed, the executioner arrived within hours. His name is Curtis Jackson. His stage name is 50 Cent. And 50 Cent has been waiting almost 2 decades for a moment exactly like this one. 50 Cent opened his phone, tapped the screen, and dropped a message so short and so surgical that it detonated across the internet within minutes. I just saw your record sales, LOL. 2000. What the F? That single sentence, casually typed and casually posted, did more damage to Rick Ross's public standing than any diss record 50 Cent has ever recorded. Because in the world of hip-hop, when your enemy laughs at you and the whole internet laughs with him, you are no longer the villain of the story. You are the punchline. But let's rewind, because you cannot understand how catastrophic this collapse really is until you understand how loud Rick Ross was before the collapse arrived. 4 months leading up to the release of Set in Stone, Rick Ross was everywhere. Rick Ross went on every major podcast. Rick Ross sat down with Joe Budden. Rick Ross appeared on morning shows, radio stations, YouTube channels, Instagram lives, and even his own car show. Rick Ross spoke about Drake. Rick Ross spoke about 50 Cent. Rick Ross spoke about Jay-Z. Rick Ross spoke about the algorithm. Rick Ross spoke about his legacy. Rick Ross spoke about hip-hop history. And through all of it, Rick Ross carried himself with the calm confidence of a man who believed the industry was still bending to his gravitational pull. Rick Ross moved like the sun in a solar system that had long since chosen a new star. There was just one problem. The industry had already stopped bending. And Rick Ross was the last person in the room to notice. The signs were there long before the numbers dropped. Rick Ross had to push back the release date of the album. Rick Ross had to keep extending the promotional window. Rick Ross had to keep showing up to more and more platforms to keep the buzz alive. And when the buzz kept fading, Rick Ross did what a lot of legacy artists do when the ground starts shaking under their feet. Rick Ross started swinging at bigger names. Rick Ross took swings at Drake. Rick Ross took swings at 50 Cent. Rick Ross made comments that raised eyebrows about Jay-Z. And every single one of those swings was designed to do one thing: keep Rick Ross in the algorithm. Every haymaker Rick Ross threw was less about the target and more about the microphone. Rick Ross was not fighting rivals. Rick Ross was fighting irrelevance. And irrelevance is undefeated. But here is the twisted truth about the algorithm that Rick Ross either did not understand or refused to accept. The algorithm does not reward noise. The algorithm rewards resonance. And when Rick Ross kept firing at Drake, the algorithm quietly began doing something no promotional dollar can undo. The algorithm started serving Rick Ross's clips exclusively to people who already disliked him. Every diss aimed at Drake landed in Drake's fanbase, where those clips became evidence of Rick Ross's desperation rather than his dominance. DJ Akademiks broke this down on a live stream in a way that lit the whole internet on fire, and once you hear the math, you cannot unhear it. Akademiks did not deliver an opinion. Akademiks delivered arithmetic. And arithmetic does not negotiate. According to Akademiks, roughly 70% of the current hip-hop audience is Drake-aligned. Around 15% is Rick Ross-aligned. And here is the deadly part, nearly every Rick Ross fan is also a Drake fan, but not every Drake fan is a Rick Ross fan. Which means the second Rick Ross forced the audience to choose a corner, the math was already lost. If you are a fan of both artists, and one starts throwing rocks at the other, you side with the one whose music you play more often. And the one you play more often, statistically, is Drake. Akademiks put it in plain English. He said the choose your corner era is not helping Rick Ross. It is quietly gutting him. And the 17,000 unit debut is the proof. Every diss Rick Ross fired was a small tax on his own future streaming revenue. Tony Yayo saw the numbers, and Tony Yayo did not hold back. Tony Yayo pointed straight at Rick Ross with the kind of blunt honesty that only somebody who has been in the industry for 2 decades can deliver without flinching. Tony Yayo asked who exactly told Rick Ross that disappearing from the front line of music for 20 years and then dropping a full album and announcing a full tour was going to work. Tony Yayo said whoever gave Rick Ross that advice does not love him. Tony Yayo said the game has moved on. Tony Yayo said even Lil Wayne, one of the most beloved artists in the modern era, struggled to come back after a shorter absence, so what exactly was Rick Ross expecting when he walked back into the arena? Tony Yayo said the mirror was cracked, and Rick Ross was still styling in it like the glass was clean. Tony Yayo also pointed out something that a lot of casual fans missed. When Rick Ross was actually at his commercial peak, the Aston Martin Rick Ross era, the deeper than rap era, the Teflon Don era, the real Ricky Ross, the original figure Rick Ross borrowed his name and mythology from, was still incarcerated. And when that real figure eventually came home and released his own project, it moved around 150,000 copies. That's a real number. That's a real event. What Rick Ross put up with set in stone is not even a fraction of what the man Rick Ross built his entire persona around achieved from a standing start. Tony Yayo did not need to elaborate. The ghost of the original Ricky Ross was outselling the rapper who borrowed the name. But the numbers were only the beginning. Because right as the sales narrative was setting in, another story started spreading across social media that made everything worse. Photos of Rick Ross's upcoming tour venues began circulating online. And what those photos revealed was catastrophic. Rick Ross had booked large capacity rooms in major markets. Rick Ross had built the tour around the assumption that his 20th anniversary would pull massive crowds. And when the seating charts leaked, the charts told a different story. Enormous sections of green dots stretched across the visual maps. Green dots that indicated unsold seats. Not a few gaps. Not a slow-selling second balcony. Entire venues sitting empty, weeks out from the show date. The maps looked less like concert layouts and more like military heat maps of a battlefield nobody showed up to fight. Then came the discount announcement. Rick Ross's team began offering buy one get one 50% off tickets in an attempt to move the inventory. And the internet caught it immediately. Screenshots of the discount promotion spread across every hip-hop page, every meme account, every commentary channel. What was supposed to be a triumphant 20-year victory lap turned into a fire sale. And 50 Cent, watching all of this from a distance, could barely contain himself. 50 Cent hopped back on Instagram and dropped another message that made half the internet fall out laughing and the other half wince in sympathy. 50 Cent said Rick Ross was getting away with the illusion for a while, but the illusion was over. 50 Cent counted 20 features on the album and paired that count with the shockingly small sales figure. And 50 Cent finished with 2 words that hit like a gavel. It's over. 2 words. That was the whole caption. And 2 words was all it took. The Wingstop jokes wrote themselves. The American Deli Wings jokes wrote themselves. The car shampoo line wrote itself. Rick Ross's diversified business empire, which had always been a legitimate source of pride for his supporters, was suddenly being used against him as evidence that he was no longer a music artist but a landlord, a franchise owner, a brand license operator dressed up in rapper clothing. And the cruelest part is that Rick Ross himself walked directly into it. When the sales conversation got hot, Rick Ross went on his own platform, popped the top of a champagne bottle, and delivered a speech that was clearly meant to look defiant but instead landed as coping. Rick Ross told his fans not to let the first week make or break them. Rick Ross compared himself to Basquiat, arguing that the true value of a work of art is not measured in its opening frame but in the generations that come after. Rick Ross reminded everyone that when other artists were pushing 1 million records in their first week, he was pushing 150,000. And Rick Ross said, with unshakable confidence, 20 years later, here we are. The internet did not receive it the way Rick Ross intended. Because here is what Rick Ross missed. When you spend 12 weeks telling the world your album is the best body of work in modern rap, you cannot then, after the numbers land, pivot to a philosophical speech about how sales do not matter. That is not resilience. That is not perspective. That is repositioning. And the audience felt the repositioning immediately. Every clip of Rick Ross bragging pre-release started getting stitched next to clips of Rick Ross downplaying sales post-release. Every confident interview started getting cut against the discounted ticket screenshots. Every mention of the algorithm started getting mocked as an excuse. The narrative was no longer under Rick Ross's control. The audience became the editor, and the editor was ruthless. And then the story got worse. Because Rick Ross did not just take the losses quietly. Rick Ross fired back at 50 Cent. Rick Ross went on his platform and asked the audience how things were going down in Shreveport. Shreveport is a reference to 50 Cent's business ventures in Louisiana, ventures that have been the subject of public disputes and controversy for months. Rick Ross accused 50 Cent of borrowing money and not returning it. Rick Ross accused 50 Cent of pulling a stunt with the film studio deal. Rick Ross tried to turn 50 Cent's business record into a counterpunch. And on paper, that was a defensible strategy. In practice, it backfired instantly. Because the audience was not looking for a fair fight. The audience was looking for a winner. And the winner had already been decided by the Billboard chart. When you are down on the scoreboard, changing the topic reads as forfeit, not as strategy. Then the fans dug up something even more devastating. Somebody remembered a line from an old Drake song. A line where Drake mocked Rick Ross's streaming numbers by saying he was aiding Ross with streams before Aiden Ross had ever streamed. That line, buried in a track from months earlier, suddenly aged into prophecy. Because when Set in Stone dropped and the streaming figures came in, they were shockingly low. Multiple analysts noted that a single recent Drake track had outperformed the entire Rick Ross album in daily streams. Screenshots flooded the timelines. The line became a meme. And the meme became a coffin lid. Drake had predicted the exact collapse in a single throwaway bar months in advance, and now the internet was replaying that bar like it was a courtroom exhibit. Every corner of the internet had a take. And here is where the situation crossed the line from a normal underperformance into a full cultural event. Charlemagne weighed in. The Breakfast Club weighed in. Podcasters weighed in. Reaction channels weighed in. Even artists who had no beef with Rick Ross found themselves being asked by interviewers what they thought of the numbers. And when your peers are being asked to comment on your commercial failure, the failure has stopped being a business story. The failure has become a cultural moment. It has left the sports page and hit the front page. And the front page never returns to the sports page in the same shape. DJ Akademiks came back and doubled down on his choose your corner theory. Akademiks argued that if Rick Ross had never gone after Drake, Rick Ross would have moved somewhere around 40,000 units in his opening frame. That's a difference of more than 20,000 copies lost, in Akademiks' estimation, purely because of the beef. Now, that is one analyst's take, and other commentators pushed back on the exact number. But nobody could seriously argue that the beef had helped. Every visible signal, the ticket sales, the stream count, the meme velocity, pointed in the same direction. Rick Ross had picked a fight in a market where the audience math was already against him, and the math had come to collect. Math never sends warnings. Math just presents the bill. And then Yayo dropped one more observation that reframed the entire conversation. Yayo asked why Rick Ross and Drake could not simply make another song together. Yayo pointed out that when Rick Ross was at his commercial peak, Drake was the alley-oop that finished half of Rick Ross's biggest anthems. Rick Ross had 2 classic albums built without Drake, that part is true, and Yayo acknowledged it. But Rick Ross's biggest songs, the ones that defined mainstream memory of his catalog, were the ones with Drake sitting on the hook. Aston Martin Music. Diced Pineapples. Lord Knows. The Drake features were not accessories. They were the engines. And Rick Ross had voluntarily walked away from the engine, then blamed the car for not moving. It is one thing to fire your co-pilot. It is another to fire your co-pilot and then blame turbulence. The algorithm conversation got even messier when Rick Ross himself acknowledged it. During an interview, Rick Ross agreed that the algorithm was against him. Rick Ross said the reason for that hostility was the amount of time he had spent talking about Drake, talking about the beef, and talking about topics that were not tightly tied to promoting the project itself. Which was, without Rick Ross realizing it, a public admission that his own promotional strategy had cannibalized his own album. The algorithm was doing exactly what algorithms do, serving audiences the content those audiences already wanted to see. And what those audiences wanted to see was not another Rick Ross diss clip. What those audiences wanted was Drake. Or Kendrick. Or Tory. Or 50. Rick Ross had turned himself into a supporting character in his own promotional cycle. And then came the Joe Budden appearance. Rick Ross sat down on the Joe Budden podcast for what was billed as a major promotional stop. The interview happened. The clips got cut. The clips went viral. But the clips that went viral were not clips about the music. The clips that went viral were the exchanges about Drake, the moments about beef, the passing shots at 50 Cent. The audience was tuning in to hear Rick Ross talk about Drake, not to hear Rick Ross talk about Set in Stone. Which meant the promotional machine was actively repelling the very listeners who might have bought the album. Every clip was a curiosity trap for beef audiences and a repellent for music audiences. The engagement was massive. The conversions were non-existent. And engagement without conversion is just noise dressed up as progress. Fans on Twitter began doing something even more brutal. Fans began cross-referencing Rick Ross's confident pre-release interviews with the actual streaming performance. Screenshots surfaced showing Rick Ross bragging about the album's quality alongside daily stream counts that were being outperformed by songs from artists who had not released anything new in months. One viral thread showed Rick Ross's Set in Stone tracks earning fewer daily streams than a Janet Jackson catalog performance from the same week. 2 million daily streams for Janet. A fraction of that for the newly released Rick Ross album. And Janet Jackson, respectfully, is not currently promoting anything. Janet was in her life, and her back catalog was still outrunning a brand new Rick Ross release. The video montages started multiplying. Compilations of Rick Ross's biggest boasts stitched next to the sales numbers. Compilations of Rick Ross's Drake disses stitched next to Drake's touring receipts. Compilations of Rick Ross's tour venue seating charts stitched next to Tory Lanez release announcement. Each montage racked up hundreds of thousands of views. And each montage carried the same emotional signature: the audience was not angry at Rick Ross. The audience was laughing at Rick Ross. And in the world of internet culture, being laughed at is far more dangerous than being hated. Hatred keeps you relevant. Laughter buries you. Every viral clip was another shovel of dirt on top of a career that used to require an army to bury. Even Rick Ross's defenders started softening. Longtime supporters who initially pushed back on the negativity began framing the situation in ways that inadvertently confirmed the decline. Supporters started saying Rick Ross was playing the long game. Supporters started saying Rick Ross was diversifying and did not need album sales to be secure. Supporters started saying Rick Ross was fine because of publishing, licensing, brand deals, and the Wingstop empire. All of which is true. All of which is fair. And all of which is exactly the kind of language people use when they are trying to protect a legacy from a present-day loss. Nobody says an artist is playing the long game when the short game is working. That phrase only surfaces when the short game has failed. Every excuse designed to defend Rick Ross was quietly confirming the very thing the excuse was trying to deny. And 50 Cent kept twisting the knife. 50 Cent posted another shot pointing out that 14 out of the 19 tracks on Set in Stone were features. 50 Cent framed the feature-heavy track list as an admission that Rick Ross needed other artists to carry the weight of the project. 50 Cent counted the features. 50 Cent counted the sales. 50 Cent posted the math. And 50 Cent captioned it with the same phrase every time. It's over. Every 50 Cent post was engineered like a stand-up punchline, setup, count, mic drop. Rick Ross was fighting a heavyweight promoter armed with an Instagram account and a decade of muscle memory in exactly this kind of warfare. Rick Ross hit back with the Shreveport line. Rick Ross accused 50 Cent of financial misconduct. Rick Ross demanded 50 Cent return money. Rick Ross tried to reframe the conversation as a business integrity debate rather than a music competition debate. And the audience shrugged. Because the audience was not interested in a philosophical argument about business ethics. The audience was interested in the leaderboard. And the leaderboard said Tory Lanez, from behind bars, had outsold Rick Ross, in his own promotional prime, by more than 2,000 units. That kind of scoreboard cannot be reframed with a caption. That kind of scoreboard just sits there, glowing, waiting for the next observer to walk by and confirm what it already says. The Choose Your Corner era is not just a slogan. It is a market condition. Modern hip-hop consumption is tribal in a way it has never been before. Fans do not just support artists. Fans align themselves with camps. And when an artist declares which camp they belong to, the fans of the opposing camp do not merely stop streaming that artist. The fans of the opposing camp actively work against that artist's algorithmic momentum. They skip the previews. They swipe past the ads. They downvote the clips. They mock the visuals. They report the promotional posts. And multiply that behavior by the 70% of hip-hop consumers who are Drake-aligned, and you have a mathematical firewall that no promotional budget can burn through. Rick Ross did not just lose fans. Rick Ross activated an opposing army that had previously been dormant. Rick Ross built that firewall himself, brick by brick, interview by interview, diss by diss. And when Rick Ross finally opened the door on release day, the firewall was already too tall to climb. The comparison to Tory Lanez is what makes this collapse historic. Tory Lanez is currently incarcerated. Tory Lanez has been the subject of one of the most publicly divisive legal cases in modern hip-hop. Tory Lanez has no active brand deals. Tory Lanez has no interview circuit. Tory Lanez has no visible team of publicists engineering a rollout. And Tory Lanez still outsold Rick Ross. Not by a small margin. Not by a rounding error. By more than 2,000 units in a single frame. That is not just a business embarrassment. That is a referendum on whether Rick Ross's entire promotional machinery is even functional in the current market. The machine is running. The machine is loud. The machine is just not producing customers. And the more analysts dug into the numbers, the worse the story got. Rick Ross's opening frame did not just come in low. It came in significantly below par for a headliner-tier veteran with a 20-year catalog. Comparable veterans in the current era tend to pull between 40,000 and 100,000 in their opening frame when they release with a proper rollout. Rick Ross pulled roughly one-third of the lower end of that range, despite executing what was arguably the most aggressive promotional push of his entire career. Which means the input was elite, but the output was catastrophic. That gap between effort and result is the exact fingerprint of an artist whose audience has quietly walked away. And a quiet exit is far more terminal than a loud one, because a quiet exit does not come back for closure. And Rick Ross's response only accelerated the departure. Instead of pausing, reassessing, and pivoting his messaging, Rick Ross doubled down. Rick Ross reminded fans about the Basquiat framework. Rick Ross reminded fans about the long game. Rick Ross reminded fans that Album of the Year status is not decided in a single frame. Rick Ross even encouraged fans not to come to the conversation with premeditated hatred. And every one of those messages, delivered in isolation, would have been dignified. Delivered in the middle of a public sales collapse, they landed as damage control. A dignified sentence in the wrong moment is not dignity anymore. It is spin. And the audience can smell spin from 3 timelines away. Because here is the rule of hip-hop that Rick Ross seems to have forgotten. You do not get to control the narrative after the numbers drop. The numbers control the narrative. Your defiance becomes desperation. Your perspective becomes cope. Your confidence becomes delusion. And the harder you push back, the more the audience laughs, because the audience knows the leaderboard is not going to move no matter how many philosophical speeches you deliver from your studio balcony. Once the scoreboard turns against you, every word you speak is subtitled by the scoreboard. 50 Cent understood this rule 20 years ago. That is why 50 Cent's post-fight commentary on his rivals has always been short, mocking, and viral. That is why 50 Cent did not write a 3,000-word essay about Rick Ross's failure. That is why 50 Cent posted 2 words. It's over. Because 50 Cent knows that in the attention economy, the shortest sentence with the loudest impact wins every round. 50 Cent does not out-argue his rivals. 50 Cent out-formats them. And format wins in a scroll-driven market. Rick Ross, on the other hand, seems to be operating with an older playbook. A playbook where lengthy interviews, physical presence, and narrative repetition still drive commercial outcomes. That playbook worked in 2010. It worked in 2013. It even worked in 2016. But it does not work in the current era, where attention is fragmented, where fandoms are tribal, and where a single 15-second clip on the wrong app can move more units than a full podcast press run. The new arena respects clip velocity, meme momentum, and tribal loyalty. Nothing else moves the needle. And now the tour is in serious trouble. The venues are visibly empty. The tickets are being discounted. The green dots on the seating charts are multiplying every day. And Rick Ross's team is left with a set of options, none of which are good. They can cancel dates and blame scheduling. They can quietly relocate to smaller rooms and pretend that was always the plan. They can push additional discounts and try to fill seats at any price. Or they can proceed as scheduled and let the visual evidence of the empty rooms document the collapse in real time. Each option carries a different flavor of damage. None of them stop the bleeding. Meanwhile, Drake is not saying a word. Drake is not tweeting. Drake is not posting reaction videos. Drake is not appearing on podcasts to comment on the numbers. Drake is doing what Drake has always done during moments when a rival is imploding, nothing. Because Drake, more than anyone in his generation, understands that when your opponent is drowning, you do not throw them a rope. You stand on the shore and let the current do the work. And the current has been doing an extraordinary amount of work these past few weeks. Drake's silence is not neutrality. Drake's silence is a strategy. And Drake's silence is louder right now than any statement Drake could actually make. There is a strange irony in all of this. Rick Ross spent months trying to force Drake into a public confrontation. Rick Ross wanted the exchange. Rick Ross wanted the fireworks. Rick Ross wanted the response. And Drake, by simply not responding, delivered the most devastating counter of all, the counter of silence. Because in the absence of a Drake response, every failed sales number, every empty venue photo, every meme, every mocking post from 50 Cent stands alone as evidence of the collapse. There is only Rick Ross, in the spotlight, holding a project that will not move. Rick Ross wanted a duel. Drake gave him a mirror. And the meta question hanging over all of this is the one nobody wants to ask directly. Was Rick Ross ever the artist he claimed to be, or was Rick Ross always a hybrid, a rapper whose commercial peak was scaffolded by the biggest features of his era, and whose current struggle is the sound of that scaffolding being removed? Because if Rick Ross's biggest hits truly required Drake, and Drake is no longer on the board, then Rick Ross's current commercial floor is not a temporary dip. It is the actual, real, unassisted market value of Rick Ross as a solo commercial force. And that number, based on the last 30 days of data, appears to sit somewhere in the low 5 figures. That is not a scary sentence. That is a diagnostic sentence. That is a brutal thing to say about an artist with 2 classic albums and a 2-decade legacy. But it is not a personal attack. It is a market observation. And markets do not care about legacy. Markets care about the current transaction. And in the current transaction, Rick Ross has been outsold by a rival in prison, outstreamed by a Drake song from months ago, outmocked by a rival he thought he had already buried, and outstrategized by a competitor who never even took the field. 4 losses in one frame. That is not a bad week. That is a collapse of an entire operating model. The final layer of this story is the one that will haunt Rick Ross the longest. Because the numbers, as bad as they are recoverable. Artists have come back from worse. But the perception shift is not recoverable in the same way. Once the culture agrees that an artist has fallen off, that consensus becomes very difficult to unwind. Every future release will now be measured against set in stone. Every future promotional push will now be viewed through the lens of the discounted tour tickets. Every future boast will now be met with the same 2 words 50 Cent posted. It's over. And whether or not it is truly over is almost irrelevant, because in the attention economy, perception is the product. And the perception has hardened. There is still a path forward for Rick Ross. There is always a path. Rick Ross could pivot back to features, sit on the hook of a younger artist's hit, and re-enter the algorithm through the side door. Rick Ross could quietly repair the Drake relationship, deliver a joint record, and reset the entire narrative in a single Friday. Rick Ross could stop talking about the algorithm, stop talking about 50 Cent, stop talking about legacy, and just release music that speaks for itself. Rick Ross has the pen. Rick Ross has the voice. Rick Ross has the catalog. What Rick Ross does not have, right now, is the audience. And the audience is the only asset an artist cannot manufacture on demand. There is also the deeper question that veteran industry insiders keep whispering behind closed doors. What happens if Rick Ross does not adjust at all? What happens if Rick Ross keeps swinging at 50 Cent, keeps subtweeting Drake, keeps popping bottles on camera, and keeps refusing to acknowledge that the market has moved? The most likely outcome is not a career ending. Rick Ross is too wealthy, too diversified, and too smart